At her own baby shower beneath white roses and polite applause, Molly Carter watched her husband lean in and kiss the blonde intern like it was nothing worth hiding. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The room chose silence over truth. Molly didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply smiled, reached into a gift bag beside her, and handed Jackson Carter a thin folder labeled in clean black ink. He thought the moment belonged to him. It didn't. If you believe silence can be strength and truth always finds its moment, stay with this story until the very end. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. The house Molly Carter lived in had the kind of silence people paid for. It sat on a quiet street in Westport, Connecticut, where the hedges were trimmed with intention, and the neighbors smiled without asking questions. The windows were large, always clean, always letting in just enough light to make everything inside appear composed. It was the kind of home that suggested stability, without ever having to say it out loud. Molly had chosen it carefully, not for the size though it was generous, not for the status though it carried weight. She chose it because it felt predictable, measured, contained. At the time, she believed those qualities would protect a life from unraveling. She'd been wrong, but not in the way most people would assume. At 32, Molly Carter was known among her limited circle as someone who did not react quickly. She listened longer than most people were comfortable with. She rarely interrupted. And when she did speak, it was usually to clarify something that had already been decided without her. That restraint had been mistaken for passivity more times than she could count. Jackson Carter had once described it as elegance. Now he simply relied on it. Jackson moved through rooms differently. He filled them. As chief financial officer of Helixara Health, a mid-sized biotech firm that had grown aggressively over the last 3 years, he had learned how to occupy space in a way that made people defer without realizing they were doing it. His voice carried just enough authority to end discussions early. His presence suggested certainty, even when the numbers underneath required more scrutiny. People trusted him because he appeared to trust himself. Molly had once trusted him for the same reason. In the early years of their marriage, his confidence felt like momentum. He made decisions quickly, and she admired that. Where she paused, he advanced. Where she observed, he acted. It created a rhythm that seemed balanced from the outside. Friends described them as complementary, efficient, aligned. They used words like solid, but solidity, Molly had come to understand, could be imitated. By the time she was 7 months pregnant, the rhythm had changed in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss if someone needed to believe everything was still intact. Jackson began coming home later. Not dramatically late. Not in ways that could be easily questioned. Just delayed enough to create small gaps between what he said and what could be verified. Traffic, dinners with investors, last-minute meetings. The explanations were always reasonable. That was what made them effective. Molly did not challenge him the first time, or the second, not even the fifth. She had no interest in becoming the kind of woman who measured her marriage by confrontation. She believed, perhaps stubbornly, that truth revealed itself without pressure. But she did notice. She noticed the way his phone was no longer left face up on the kitchen counter. The way notifications were cleared before he entered a room. The way he stepped outside to take calls he once would have answered beside her without hesitation. None of these were accusations on their own. Together, they formed a pattern, and Molly had always been good with patterns. She did not speak of it. Instead, she adjusted. She began to pay closer attention to the small details that most people ignored. Calendar alerts, expense notifications. The names that appeared repeatedly in casual conversation always framed as insignificant. One name in particular surfaced more often than the rest: Lily Hart. At first, Lily was introduced as an intern. Temporary, bright, eager to learn. Jackson mentioned her in passing, usually in the context of how efficient she was, how quickly she picked things up, how she handled tasks beyond her level. It sounded like mentorship. That was how it was presented. Molly nodded when he spoke about her. She asked polite questions. She even smiled once when he described Lily staying late to help prepare materials for a board presentation. There was nothing in his tone that suggested anything inappropriate. But tone, Molly knew, could be practiced. Weeks passed, and Lily's presence in their conversations did not diminish. It expanded. Her name appeared in different contexts, now travel coordination, client follow-ups, budget preparation. Responsibilities that did not typically belong to an intern. Molly did not point that out. Instead, she filed it away. Her own background in operations had trained her to recognize inefficiencies. Processes that did not align with structure. Roles that expanded without oversight. It was not suspicion that guided her attention. It was familiarity. Things that were out of place had a way of becoming visible to her, even when no one else seemed to notice. And increasingly, things felt out of place. It wasn't just Lily. It was the numbers. Jackson sometimes worked from home, especially when preparing quarterly reports or investor updates. On those days, he would set up at the dining table, documents spread neatly in front of him, laptop open, phone within reach. Molly would move quietly through the space, never interrupting, never looking directly at what he was doing. But she saw enough. Columns of figures. Adjustments that seemed small individually but significant when considered together. Expenses categorized in ways that felt flexible. She did not question him about it. Not yet. Because questions she understood often led to answers that were designed to close a conversation and not open it. And Molly was no longer interested in closing anything prematurely. Instead, she began to remember. Not in a dramatic way, not with notebooks or recordings. Just mentally, dates, amounts, names. She remembered the night he mentioned a consulting firm she had never heard of, Virion Consulting. He described it as a strategic partner, necessary, efficient. She remembered the way he avoided eye contact when he said it. She remembered the slight delay before he answered when she asked what exactly they specialized in. Operational support, he had said. It was vague. Molly did not press further, but the name stayed with her. So did the feeling that something about it was incomplete. As the weeks moved closer to the baby shower, the distance between what was said and what was real became harder to ignore. Not because Jackson's behavior had become more careless, but because Molly's attention had become more precise. She was not looking for betrayal. She was identifying inconsistency. There was a difference. One evening, as the sun set through the wide kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertops, Molly stood alone, one hand resting lightly against the curve of her stomach. The house was quiet again. Jackson had texted earlier, running late, dinner with a potential investor. The message was short, efficient, expected. Molly read it once, then set her phone down. She did not sigh. She did not react. Instead, she walked to the dining table where his laptop had been earlier that day. It was gone now, packed away, taken with him. But a single document remained partially tucked beneath a stack of neatly arranged papers. She hesitated for a moment. Not because she felt she was crossing a line, but because she understood that once she looked, she would no longer be able to pretend she hadn't seen anything. That kind of clarity changed things. Slowly, she reached for the paper and pulled it free. It was a printed expense summary. At first glance, it looked routine. Categories, dates, vendor names. But then she saw it. Virion Consulting, LLC. Multiple entries. Amounts that were not insignificant. Molly's gaze lingered on the numbers, her expression unchanged. There was no immediate conclusion, No dramatic realization. Just a quiet shift. Something settling into place. She placed the document back exactly where she found it, aligning the edges, carefully restoring the appearance of order. Then she stepped away from the table. Her movements were calm, measured, the same way they had always been. But something had changed. Not in the house, not in the silence, in her. Molly Carter did not confront problems the moment they appeared. She waited, she observed, and when she finally acted, it was never without reason. The baby shower was 3 weeks away, and by then, she intended to understand everything. Patterns rarely announced themselves. They formed quietly, almost politely, arranging small inconsistencies into something that could still be dismissed if someone needed it to be. Most people did. It was easier to preserve a version of reality than to rebuild one from fragments. Molly Carter had once understood that instinct. Now she studied it. Jackson did not become reckless overnight. That would have been simpler to identify. Instead, his behavior shifted in increments so minor that each change taken alone could be explained. It was only when Molly allowed them to sit together side by side uninterrupted that they began to take shape. The late evenings continued, always justified, always accompanied by context that sounded reasonable enough to discourage further questions. Investor dinner ran long. Last-minute numbers didn't align. Had to step in for someone who dropped the ball. The phrasing was consistent, professional, clean, too clean. Molly noticed the repetition before she noticed the content. The structure of his explanations rarely changed, even when the circumstances supposedly did. It was as if the language had been rehearsed not for deception, but for efficiency. That detail mattered, because rehearsed language created distance. It replaced reality with performance. She did not interrupt him when he spoke. She nodded when expected. She asked a question here and there, not to challenge, but to observe how he answered. And that was where the first cracks appeared. There were delays now, not long ones, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A pause before specifics, a glance away before eye contact was restored. These were not signs most people would recognize. But Molly had spent years in environments where decisions depended on reading what was not being said as much as what was. She did not interpret the pauses emotionally. She categorized them. One evening, he mentioned Lily again. "She stayed late to help me finalize the presentation," Jackson said, loosening his tie as he stepped into the kitchen. "Picked things up faster than most of the associates." Molly stood by the counter slicing fruit she had no intention of eating. "That's impressive," she replied, her tone neutral. "How long has she been there now?" "Few months," he said. "She's adaptable." There was that word again. Molly let it sit between them. "And she's working directly with you?" she asked, not looking up immediately. "Occasionally," Jackson said. "When needed. Occasionally, when needed." The boundaries of his answers were becoming softer, less defined. Not because he wanted to reveal more, but because he assumed the questions did not require precision. Molly set the knife down carefully. "Does she handle any of the vendor coordination?" she asked. Jackson hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. "Sometimes," he said. "Why no reason?" Molly replied, turning slightly to face him. "Just trying to understand how the team is structured." Her expression gave him nothing to work with. No suspicion, no accusation, just curiosity. That made it easier for him to move on. "Everything's running smoothly," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." Molly nodded once. "I'm not worried." And she wasn't. Worry implied uncertainty. What she felt was different. It was alignment. pieces beginning to connect, not completely, but enough to suggest that there was a system behind what had initially appeared random. Later that night, after Jackson had gone upstairs, Molly remained in the kitchen a while longer. The house had settled into its usual stillness, the kind that amplified even the smallest sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. She dried her hands slowly, then reached for her phone. Not to confront, not to search impulsively, but to confirm. She opened her email and scrolled through the shared household account they occasionally used for joint expenses and scheduling. It was not a primary source of information. Jackson was careful with anything that mattered. But care was not perfection. There were fragments, receipts forwarded automatically, calendar confirmations, notifications that existed in the periphery of larger systems. Molly didn't rush. She moved through them with patience, reading subject lines, noting dates, matching them against what she remembered. That was when she saw it. A calendar entry, 2 weeks prior. Client, dinner Westport. The time aligned with one of the nights Jackson had come home late, the one he had described as an investor meeting. Molly opened the entry. There were no client names listed, no location details beyond a general address, but there was an attachment, a reservation confirmation. She tapped it. The restaurant was familiar, not for business meetings. It was known for something else entirely: privacy. Private booths, discreet service, not the kind of place companies used for formal investor dinners. Molly read the confirmation twice. Then she closed it. Her expression did not change, but the pattern sharpened. She did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she added the information to what she already knew. Another small inconsistency, another piece. The next morning, Jackson left early, earlier than usual. He mentioned a breakfast meeting as he grabbed his keys, his movements efficient, practiced. Molly stood by the doorway, watching him. "Drive safe," she said. He smiled briefly. "Always do." The door closed behind him. And just like that, the house returned to silence. Molly didn't move immediately. She remained where she was for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wall beside her. Then, without urgency, she walked to the dining table. His laptop was there, closed, left behind. That in itself was unusual. Jackson rarely left it. Molly approached it slowly, not because she felt hesitant, but because she understood the significance of the moment. This was no longer observation from a distance. This was proximity. She placed her hand on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the stillness of the room. Then she opened the laptop. The screen lit up instantly. No password prompt. He had forgotten to lock it. Or perhaps he had assumed there was no need. Either way, the result was the same. Molly did not rush. She did not start searching randomly. She navigated with intention. Email first, work account. The inbox was open. Messages organized, clean, too clean. But there were threads. Archived, not deleted. That distinction mattered. Deleted information was harder to recover. Archived information suggested it was meant to be hidden, not erased. Molly opened one of the threads. Virion Consulting LLC. The name appeared in the subject line. Her gaze moved steadily across the screen. Invoices, approvals, transfer confirmations. The amounts were larger here than what she had seen in the printed summary, significantly larger. She read the email chain from the beginning. The language was formal, transactional. But there were inconsistencies. Approvals bypassing standard protocols. Requests marked urgent without justification. And then further down, a name. Lily Hart, included in the thread. Not as a recipient of information, as an active participant, authorizing, confirming, following up. Molly paused. Not in shock, in recognition. This was no longer a question of possibility. It was structure, systematic, intentional. She continued reading. Another thread. Different subject. Same pattern. Funds routed through Virion. Documentation adjusted. Language softened to obscure purpose. And always somewhere in the exchange, Jackson and Lily, together. Not always directly, but consistently enough to remove doubt. Molly leaned back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her breathing remained steady. There was no visible reaction, no immediate decision, just clarity, the kind that did not demand urgency, because urgency belonged to people who needed to react. Molly did not. She closed the laptop, gently returning it to exactly the position she had found it in. No trace of disturbance, no indication that anything had changed. But everything had. The pattern was no longer forming. It had formed, and now it was complete enough to act on. Molly stood adjusting the sleeve of her sweater with quiet precision. There would be more to gather, more to confirm, but the direction was clear. This was not just about a man who had grown distant. It was about a man who believed his distance made him invisible, and that belief would be his first real mistake. By the time certainty arrived, Molly Carter did not treat it as a discovery. She treated it as a beginning. There was a difference. Discovery demanded reaction. It pulled emotion forward, asked for confrontation, pushed toward resolution. Beginning, on the other hand, required structure. It asked for patience, for sequence, for restraint. Molly chose structure. The morning after she accessed Jackson's laptop, she did not change her routine. She moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her for years. Coffee brewed, curtains opened. A short list of calls returned. Her movements remained measured, her tone unchanged. Nothing in her behavior suggested that anything had shifted. But internally, everything had. She no longer observed to understand. She observed to document. The distinction shaped every decision she made over the following days. She began with what was already accessible. Shared systems, overlapping accounts, fragments that did not require intrusion to obtain. The household email account provided a starting point, but it was not sufficient on its own. Molly expanded outward, carefully mapping connections rather than forcing entry. Vendor names, payment schedules, calendar alignments. Each detail was noted mentally first, then transferred into something more durable. She did not use her primary phone. Instead, she retrieved an older device from a drawer in her home office, a phone she had replaced the previous year. It still functioned. It still connected to Wi-Fi. Most importantly, it existed outside the pattern of her current digital footprint. She powered it on, set it up with a new email account, and began to store information. Screenshots, forwarded receipts, copies of calendar entries. Nothing excessive, nothing reckless. Only what could be justified, if ever questioned. Molly understood that information gathered without discipline often became unusable. It lost credibility, it blurred intent. So she was precise. Dates were labeled, sources were identified. Nothing was altered. She was not building a case to argue. She was preserving a record to withstand scrutiny. The name Virion Consulting LLC appeared repeatedly across the data she collected. Each instance reinforced what she had already begun to suspect: the company functioned as more than a legitimate vendor. It was a conduit. Funds moved through it with a consistency that suggested planning, not oversight. Molly did not attempt to access the company directly. That would have required steps she was not prepared to take yet. Instead, she traced its presence through Jackson's communications. Email threads revealed patterns of urgency that felt manufactured. Requests marked as time-sensitive without explanation. Approvals granted quickly, often outside standard reporting cycles. And always in some capacity, Lily Hart was present. not as a passive recipient, as an active participant. That detail carried weight. It suggested awareness, not necessarily full understanding, but enough involvement to matter. Molly did not assign motive. She documented behavior. 3 days into her quiet collection, Molly made a call she had delayed until she was certain it was necessary. Rachel Lynn answered on the second ring. Molly. There was a brief pause before Molly spoke. "I need to ask you something procedural," she said, her voice even. Rachel did not interrupt. She had known Molly long enough to understand that when she spoke like this, the situation had already moved beyond casual concern. "Go ahead." If someone suspects financial misconduct within a company, Molly began choosing each word with care. What's the safest way to protect themselves legally if they're married to the person involved? There was no immediate response. Rachel exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "That depends on how much exposure there is," she said, "and how early you act." "I'm early," Molly replied. Another pause. "Are you asking hypothetically?" Rachel asked. Molly did not answer the question directly. "I haven't made any claims," she said. "I'm asking about risk." That was enough. Rachel adjusted her tone. "Then you need to think in terms of separation of liability," she said. "Documentation, proof of awareness versus involvement, and timing." "Timing," Molly repeated. "When you act," Rachel said, "too soon and you don't have enough to support what you're saying. Too late and you're seen as complicit." Molly absorbed that. "I understand." "Do you have documentation?" Rachel asked. "Yes." "How much enough to see a pattern?" Molly said, "Not enough to define the full scope." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Then don't confront him," she said finally. "Not yet. I wasn't planning to." I figured, Rachel replied. "You're not the type." There was no judgment in her voice, only recognition. "What should I do?" Molly asked. "Preserve everything," Rachel said. "Original sources. Don't edit. Don't interpret. Just keep it intact. And don't access anything you're not legally allowed to. I won't." And Molly, Rachel added, her tone tightening slightly. "If this is what I think it is, this won't stay contained. Once it surfaces, it will move fast." Molly looked out through the window as Rachel spoke. The trees beyond the yard were still unmoved by whatever was building inside the house. "I know," she said. "Then be ready for that," Rachel said, emotionally and legally. Molly did not respond immediately. "I'm not acting emotionally," she said after a moment. "I know," Rachel replied. "That's what worries me." The call ended shortly after. Molly set her phone down, her expression unchanged. Rachel's concern did not alter her approach. It confirmed it. Over the next week, Molly refined her process. She established a rhythm: morning review and organize, afternoon observe and note, evening confirm and store. Jackson's behavior remained consistent. If anything, his confidence appeared to grow. He moved through the house with the same ease, the same certainty that had always defined him. He did not notice the shift in Molly, or if he did not interpret it as significant. That too was part of the pattern. One evening, he mentioned an upcoming internal review at Helixara. "Nothing major," he said, scrolling through his phone as he spoke. "Just routine." Molly looked up briefly. "Quarterly audit?" she asked. "Something like that." The answer was vague. Molly held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. "And Virion is part of that?" she asked. Jackson's eyes flickered. "Just once." "No," he said. "They're external." External. The words settled into place. Molly nodded. "Of course." She returned her attention to the book in her lap, turning the page slowly. The conversation ended there. But the detail remained. External vendors were often subject to less immediate scrutiny. They existed just far enough outside the core structure to avoid regular examination, unless someone chose to look. Molly did not look further that night. She didn't need to. The pieces were aligning, not perfectly, but clearly enough to form direction. 3 weeks. That was the time remaining before the baby shower. Molly did not rush to accelerate anything. She allowed the days to pass with the same controlled pace she had established. Because what she was building did not depend on speed. It depended on precision. And when she finally chose to act, it would not be to accuse. It would be to present, quietly, completely, in a way that did not require belief, only recognition. Molly Carter did not need Jackson to admit anything. She only needed the truth to stand where it could no longer be ignored, and she was getting closer to that point with every passing day. Money, unlike people, did not hesitate. It moved when directed. It left traces when handled. And no matter how carefully it was routed, it always retained a memory of where it had been. Molly Carter trusted that. Not because she believed money was honest, but because it was consistent. It followed structure. Even when someone tried to obscure it, the effort itself created new patterns, unnatural ones. And unnatural patterns, when examined long enough, revealed intent. By the second week after her call with Rachel, Lynn Molly had shifted her attention almost entirely toward financial movement. The emotional inconsistencies, late nights, rehearsed explanations, and the presence of Lily Hart had already served their purpose. They had pointed her in the right direction. Now she needed confirmation that could exist independently of behavior. She began with what she could access without intrusion: household accounts, shared tax documents, archived statements stored in cloud folders Jackson had once considered too routine to secure aggressively. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Mortgage payments, utility bills, routine transfers between checking and savings. The kind of financial rhythm that defined a stable, upper-middle-class household in a place like Westport. But Molly wasn't looking for the obvious. She was looking for deviation. And deviation rarely announced itself in large, dramatic transactions. It hid in repetition, in frequency, in amounts that seemed insignificant until viewed collectively. That was where Virion Consulting LLC reappeared, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that persisted. Small amounts at first, 5,000, 8,000, 12. Spread across different dates, different categories, consulting fees, marketing support, strategic analysis. The labels varied. The destination did not. Molly created a timeline, not on paper, not digitally in a way that could be easily found. She constructed it mentally first, then transferred it carefully into her secondary device, organizing entries by date amount and corresponding documentation. The pattern emerged slowly. But when it did, it was unmistakable. The payments were structured to avoid detection. They stayed just below thresholds that would trigger automatic review. They were distributed across multiple reporting periods. They aligned with moments when company attention would be directed elsewhere: quarterly closings, investor updates, internal restructuring. It was not random. It was designed. Molly did not feel shock. She felt confirmation. What she had initially suspected as inconsistency had become something else entirely. A system. She leaned back in her chair, the soft light from the desk lamp casting a steady glow across the documents in front of her. Her hand rested lightly against the curve of her stomach, an unconscious gesture that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. There was a stillness in the room. Not empty, focused. Molly did not rush to the next step. Instead, she asked a different question. Where was the money going after Virion? That required more than surface-level access. It required context. The next morning, she reached out to Rachel again. This time, she did not frame the conversation as hypothetical. I need to understand how layered transactions are traced, Molly said once the call connected. Rachel was silent for a moment. Have you found something? She asked. I've found enough to know it's structured, Molly replied. That's not the same as proving it's fraudulent. I'm not trying to prove it yet, Molly said. I'm trying to follow it. Rachel exhaled quietly. You need a forensic accountant, she said. Someone who can map flow across entities. Can you recommend someone I can? Rachel said. But Molly, once you involve another professional, you're expanding the circle. That changes the risk. I understand. Do you? Rachel pressed, not unkindly. Because if this leads where I think it might, you're not just dealing with marital fallout. You're stepping into corporate liability, possibly criminal. Molly's voice did not shift. I know. There was a pause. Then Rachel spoke again, more measured this time. I'll connect you with someone discreet, she said. Name's Daniel Brooks. He's worked cases like this before. Quietly. Thank you, Molly, Rachel added, before ending the call. Be careful who you trust with what you have. I am, Molly said. And she was. 2 days later, Molly met Daniel Brooks in a small office in Stamford. The building was unremarkable. No signage that drew attention. No indication of the kind of work conducted inside. That was intentional. Daniel was older than she expected. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. His manner was calm, almost detached, as if he had spent years removing himself from the emotional weight of the cases he handled. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He listened. Molly presented what she had collected. Not everything. Only what was necessary to establish direction. Daniel reviewed the documents in silence, his eyes moving steadily across the pages, occasionally making small notes in the margin of his notebook. When he finished, he looked up. This isn't sloppy, he said. Molly did not respond. It's structured, he continued. Layered. Someone's been careful. I thought so. Daniel nodded once. Virion Consulting, he said. Likely a pass-through entity. For what depends, he replied. Could be personal enrichment, could be off-book payments, could be something larger. Can you trace it? Daniel closed the folder gently. I can start, he said. But understand something, tracing is one thing. Proving intent is another. I'm not asking you to prove intent. Good, he said, because that comes later. Molly leaned slightly forward. What do you need from me? Time, Daniel said. And access to anything else you can legally obtain. I won't cross legal boundaries. Then we'll work within them, he replied. It just takes longer. Molly nodded. That's fine. Daniel studied her for a moment. You're very calm, he said. I don't need to be anything else. Molly replied. He didn't challenge that. Instead, he gathered the documents and placed them neatly back into the folder. I'll be in touch, he said. The meeting ended without formality. No handshake that lingered. No unnecessary reassurance. Just process. As Molly stepped back into the afternoon light, the world outside continued as if nothing had shifted. Cars moved, people walked, conversations carried on. But Molly understood something now, with greater clarity than before. This was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about pieces that might or might not fit. The structure existed, and it was deliberate. Jackson had not made a series of mistakes. He had built something, carefully, confidently, with the assumption that no one close enough to see it would ever choose to look. Molly did not feel anger as she drove home. She did not rehearse confrontation. She did not imagine outcomes. Instead, she returned to the same steady rhythm she had established. Observe, document, preserve. Because money did not lie. But it also did not speak on its own. It needed to be placed in the right context, at the right time, in front of the right people. And when that moment came, Molly intended for it to be undeniable. By the time the invitations were finalized, Molly Carter understood something most people in that room would never consider. A gathering was never just a gathering. Not when it was curated. Not when every name had been selected with intention. The baby shower had been Jackson's idea. He presented it casually at first, over dinner, between conversations that carried no visible weight. "We should do something proper," he said, scrolling through his phone without looking up. "Invite people. Make it memorable." Molly had looked at him, then her expression neutral. "Memorable for who?" she asked. "For us," he replied. "For the baby." The answer had been immediate, too immediate. But Molly did not challenge it. Instead, she nodded once. All right. That was all it took. From that moment on, Jackson took control of the event with the same confidence he applied to everything else in his life. He chose the venue, a private country club just outside the city, known for its discretion and polished service. He approved the decor, the catering, the guest experience. He built the event the way he built his public image. Carefully, strategically, and with the assumption that presentation could shape perception. Molly allowed him to. She participated where expected, confirmed details, reviewed layouts, responded to messages from vendors and coordinators with quiet efficiency. But she paid closest attention to the guest list, because that was where intention revealed itself most clearly. Jackson didn't invite randomly. He invited selectively. Board members from Helixara Health, senior executives who held influence over internal decisions, the head of human resources, Ethan Cole, two investors who had recently increased their stake in the company, a handful of colleagues who operated close enough to Jackson to recognize his authority, but not close enough to question it. Family, of course, was included. Molly's parents, Jackson's mother, a few close friends. But the balance was clear. This was not just a celebration. It was a room. And Jackson had filled it with witnesses he believed would reinforce his position, not challenge it. Molly recognized that immediately, and she agreed to every name. She did not suggest removals. She did not question additions. If anything, she encouraged inclusion. "Are you sure you don't want to invite Daniel Reeves?" she asked one afternoon, reviewing the list on her tablet. Jackson looked up. "The audit director?" he asked. Molly nodded lightly. "He's been involved in the last 2 reviews, hasn't he?" Jackson hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yeah," he said, "but this isn't really his kind of event." Molly tilted her head slightly, considering. "It might be nice," she said, "to include people who've supported your work." There was no pressure in her tone, no implication, just a suggestion that sounded reasonable enough to accept. Jackson studied her briefly, then shrugged. "Sure," he said. "Add him." Molly made the update without comment. Another name, another presence. Each addition served a purpose. Not for Jackson, for her. Over the next few days, she continued in the same way. Subtle, measured. She ensured that key individuals were present. Not too many. Not enough to make the list feel unusual. Just enough to create the right audience. Because Molly understood something Jackson did not. Truth, when revealed privately, could be denied. Truth, when revealed publicly, carefully, precisely in front of the right people, became something else entirely. It became difficult to contain. That did not mean she intended to create a spectacle. She had no interest in chaos, no desire for confrontation. But she did understand timing and visibility. One evening, as they sat together reviewing final confirmations, Jackson leaned back in his chair, a satisfied expression settling across his face. "This is going to be good," he said. "People will remember this." Molly glanced to the screen, then at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "They will." He didn't notice the difference in her tone. Or if he did, he interpreted it as agreement. That too was part of the pattern. He saw what aligned with his expectations. Everything else passed unnoticed. Lily Hart's name appeared on the guest list 2 days later, not under Jackson's direct invitation, but through a broader category: team members assisting with event coordination. Molly saw it immediately. She did not remove it. She did not question it. Instead, she confirmed the RSVP, because Lily's presence was not an interruption to the plan. It was part of it. The days leading up to the event moved quickly, but Molly did not feel rushed. Her process remained steady. Documentation continued. Daniel Brooks had begun tracing the financial pathways beyond Virion, providing updates that confirmed the structure was more complex than it initially appeared. Layered, distributed, carefully managed. Molly absorbed the information without reacting. Each confirmation added weight to what she already held. But it did not change her approach. She was not gathering evidence to convince herself. She had already reached that point. She was preparing for something else. The night before the baby shower, Molly stood alone in the living room, the house dim, except for the soft light from a single lamp near the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Still. She rested her hand against her stomach, feeling the subtle movement beneath her skin. A reminder, not of vulnerability, of clarity. Everything she was doing now was anchored in that. Not in anger, not in betrayal, in precision. Behind her, footsteps approached. "Jackson, you should get some rest," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Big day tomorrow." Molly turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "I will," she said. He stepped closer, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that might have felt reassuring once. Now it registered as something else, routine. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said. "It's important." Molly held his gaze for a moment longer. "Yes," she replied. "It is." He smiled faintly, then stepped away, heading toward the stairs. Molly remained where she was, still, unmoving, until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Then she turned back toward the window. The reflection staring back at her was unchanged, calm, composed. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. The room was ready. The people were chosen. The timing was set. And Jackson Carter still believed he was in control of all of it. He wasn't. He had built the stage. But Molly had decided what would happen on it. By the time the guest list settled into its final form, Molly Carter had already moved past the need to confirm suspicion. She was no longer asking whether something was wrong. She was documenting how it worked. The difference changed everything. Her process became quieter, more deliberate, less reactive. She did not look for dramatic evidence. She looked for continuity, how one detail supported another, how each fragment reinforced a structure that had already begun to reveal itself. Mornings were reserved for organization, afternoons for observation, evenings for confirmation. It was not a rigid schedule, but it was consistent enough to create clarity. Jackson never questioned it. From his perspective, Molly had simply settled into the final stretch of pregnancy, slower, more inward, less engaged in anything beyond preparing for the baby. He interpreted her quiet as vulnerability. That interpretation protected her. It gave her space, and Molly used that space carefully. The older phone she had activated remained her primary storage point. She kept it in a drawer in her home office, tucked beneath documents that held no significance. It never left the house. It never connected to any account that could be traced back to her daily use. Every piece of information she collected passed through that device. Screenshots were labeled with dates. Emails were forwarded in their original form. Audio files were stored without edits. Nothing was altered. Nothing was interpreted. Because Molly understood that the value of evidence was not in how it was presented, but in how it could withstand being questioned. 3 days before the baby shower, Daniel Brooks called. His updates had been measured up to that point, incremental confirmations, cautious observations. But this time, his tone carried a shift. "I've traced part of the flow beyond Virion," he said. Molly closed the door to her office before responding. "And there's a secondary layer," he said. "Another entity receiving transfers from Virion, not directly tied to Helixara." Molly leaned against the desk, her posture relaxed. "Personal, likely." Daniel replied. "The timing matches the outflows you documented. Funds move from Helixara into Virion, then from Virion into this second account." "Whose account?" "I don't have a confirmed name yet," he said. "But I have a location." Molly waited. "Residential property in Manhattan," Daniel continued. "High-end lease. Payments align with the transfer amounts." Molly absorbed that without visible reaction. "Can you confirm occupancy working on it?" he said. "But based on the pattern, it's consistent. Rent, utilities, recurring charges, all covered through that flow." Molly's gaze shifted briefly to the window, then back. "And Lily?" she asked. There was a pause. "She appears in related communications," Daniel said carefully. "Not as the account holder, but connected." That was enough. "Keep tracing," Molly said. "I will," he replied. "But Molly, this is beyond minor misuse. This is structured diversion." "I understand." "Then you also understand what happens if this surfaces?" "Yes." Daniel hesitated, as if considering whether to say more. "You're handling this very precisely," he said finally. Molly did not respond to the observation. "I'll update you when I have confirmation," he added. The call ended. Molly stood still for a moment after placing the phone down. Not thinking, not reacting, simply allowing the information to settle into place alongside everything else she had gathered. Another layer, another confirmation, not of possibility, of design. She returned to her desk and opened the secondary device, adding Daniel's update to her records. No commentary, no interpretation, just facts, date, source, summary. The structure of her documentation mirrored the structure she was uncovering, clean-ordered, impossible to dismiss as emotional. That evening, Jackson came home earlier than usual. It was unexpected. He moved through the house with a lighter energy, as if something had gone well. "Everything's set for tomorrow," he said, loosening his jacket as he stepped into the living room. Venue confirmed. Catering locked in. Should run smoothly." Molly looked up from the couch where she had been sitting quietly. "I'm sure it will," she said. He smiled, dropping his keys onto the table. "You don't seem excited," he added. Molly tilted her head slightly. "I am," she said. "Just calm." He studied her for a moment. "You've been like that a lot lately," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, just observation. Molly met his gaze. "I think some things deserve calm," she replied. He considered that, then shrugged lightly. "Fair enough." He moved past her, heading toward the kitchen. "Lily's helping coordinate things tomorrow," he added casually. "She's been handling a lot of the vendor communication." Molly did not look away. "That's efficient," she said. "Yeah," Jackson replied. "She's been useful. The words settled into place without resistance. Molly nodded once. "I'm glad you have support," she said. Jackson didn't respond. He didn't need to. From his perspective, the conversation had already ended. Later that night, as the house quieted, Molly moved through her final checks. Not of emotion, of preparation. The dossier was complete. Printed, organized, structured in a way that required no explanation. Timeline first. Then supporting documents, emails, transfers, audio transcripts, each section clearly marked. each piece reinforcing the next. It was not overwhelming. It was precise, enough to establish pattern, enough to raise questions that could not be dismissed, and most importantly, enough to stand on its own. Molly placed the folder inside a neutral gift bag, folding the tissue paper carefully over the top. From the outside, it looked like everything else that would be exchanged the next day. Soft, ordinary, expected. She set it aside near the entryway among other items prepared for the event. Then she stepped back. Her gaze lingered on it for a moment. Not with hesitation, with acknowledgement. This was not an act of confrontation. It was a presentation, a placement of truth into a space where it could no longer be ignored. Molly turned off the lights and moved upstairs without looking back. The house settled into silence once more. But it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence before something defined. And in that silence, one thing remained clear. Jackson Carter believed tomorrow would be a celebration. Molly knew it would be something else entirely. Morning arrived without hesitation. Light moved steadily across the Carter house, touching every surface with the same clarity it always had, as if nothing beneath it had shifted. Molly Carter stood in the bedroom, fastening the final clasp of a pale tailored dress designed for softness, something appropriate for a celebration that centered on expectation, on new life, on the quiet promise of what was coming next. The fabric fell gently over her frame, accommodating the curve of her pregnancy without drawing excessive attention. Everything about her appearance was intentional, understated, composed, unremarkable in the way that made people underestimate what stood in front of them. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual, not searching for reassurance, but confirming alignment. There was no visible tension, no trace of the calculations that had occupied her for weeks, just stillness. Behind her, Jackson moved with the casual efficiency of someone stepping into a role he had already rehearsed. "You ready?" he asked, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. Molly turned slightly. "Yes," she said. He smiled, satisfied. "Good. Today should be perfect." The word lingered. Perfect. Molly did not challenge it. Instead, she reached for her coat, her movements unhurried. "Let's go," she said. The drive to the country club was quiet, not uncomfortable, not strained, simply absent of anything unnecessary. Jackson spoke occasionally about logistics, about the schedule, about who would be arriving early and who might be late. His voice carried the same controlled confidence Molly had come to expect. He was managing the event in his mind, ensuring every detail aligned with his vision. Molly listened. She did not interrupt, because none of it required adjustment. By the time they arrived, the venue was already in motion. Staff moved efficiently across the space. Finalizing arrangements, tables were set with polished precision white linen stretching across their surfaces without a crease. Floral arrangements, white roses and soft greenery had been placed at measured intervals, creating a uniformity that suggested care without excess. The room felt bright, open, carefully constructed to evoke ease. Molly stepped inside and paused briefly, allowing her eyes to move across the space. She did not scan for flaws. She registered presence, entry points, sight lines, positions, where people would stand, where attention would settle. Jackson moved ahead of her, immediately engaging with the event coordinator, his tone confident, assured. "Everything looks great," he said. "We're right on schedule." "Exactly on time," the coordinator replied. Molly remained slightly behind, observing. From this angle, she could see how the room would fill, where conversations would gather, where movement would slow. It was not a large space, but it was designed to feel expansive. Enough openness to allow visibility, enough intimacy to keep people within proximity of each other. No one would be isolated. That mattered. Guests began to arrive within the hour, first in small groups, then more steadily. Colleagues, friends, family. Each arrival carried the same sequence. Greeting, smile, brief exchange of congratulations, a glance at Molly's stomach, a comment about how radiant she looked. She accepted it all with the same measured warmth. "Thank you. That's kind of you. I appreciate it." Her tone never varied, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had chosen consistency. Jackson moved through the room with ease, greeting guests, shaking hands, exchanging light conversation. His presence drew attention without effort. People deferred to him instinctively, aligning themselves with his energy, his pace. Molly watched that dynamic unfold. Not critically, not emotionally, simply as fact. Ethan Cole arrived next, the head of human resources. He approached Molly with a polite smile, his posture slightly more reserved than the others. "Molly, you look wonderful," he said. "Thank you, Ethan," she replied. He glanced briefly toward Jackson, then back to her. "Congratulations," he added. "Thank you." There was a pause, subtle, but present, as if he wanted to say something more, but chose not to. Molly did not fill the silence. She allowed it to pass. Moments later, Daniel Reeves entered. Audit director. His presence was quieter, less noticeable to most. But not to Molly. He greeted Jackson first, a brief exchange of professional familiarity, then turned to Molly. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you for coming," Molly replied. He nodded, once his expression neutral, observant. Molly recognized it and noted it. The room continued to fill, conversations layered over one another, creating a soft hum that blended seamlessly with the background music. Glasses were lifted, laughter surfaced and faded. Everything moved as expected. Until Lily Hart arrived. She entered without hesitation, confident, composed, dressed carefully appropriate, but with a precision that suggested awareness of attention. Jackson noticed her immediately. Of course he did. He moved toward her without delay, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly more relaxed, less formal. Their interaction was brief at first, a greeting, a smile. But the distance between them was smaller than it should have been. Molly watched from across the room, not directly, not obviously, but enough to confirm what had already been established. Lily was not uncertain of her place here. She moved as if she belonged. That detail carried more weight than anything else, because belonging implied permission, and permission implied assumption. Molly turned slightly, accepting a drink from a passing server. She did not drink it. She held it, a prop. Something to occupy her hands without drawing attention. The room reached full capacity within the next 20 minutes. Every name on the list had arrived, every position filled. The environment settled into a steady rhythm, predictable, controlled. From Jackson's perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as intended. Molly knew better. Because intention was not determined by who organized the event. It was determined by who understood it. She moved slowly through the space, positioning herself where visibility was natural, not forced. She engaged when spoken to, stepped back when conversation did not require her presence. Her awareness remained constant, not fixed on any single point, distributed. Then at the center of the room, Jackson raised his glass. A subtle signal. Attention shifted toward him almost immediately. Conversations softened. Movement slowed. People turned. Molly felt the shift before she saw it. The room aligning, the moment forming. Jackson began to speak, lightly at first. Gratitude, acknowledgement. The kind of speech expected in a setting like this. His tone carried confidence. control, ownership. Molly stood still, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. Across the room, Lily watched him, not as an employee, as something else, something assumed. Molly noted that too. The air in the room tightened slightly, not enough to register consciously, but enough to exist. A subtle shift, a change in weight. Jackson stepped closer to Lily as he spoke. The movement was small, but deliberate. Molly's gaze remained steady, not on them, on the space around them, the witnesses, the angles, the silence beginning to form beneath the surface noise. Because Molly understood something no one else in that room had yet realized. The stage was not defined by decoration, or by speech, or by who believed they controlled it. It was defined by timing. And timing had already shifted. Jackson did not rush the moment. He never did. Control to him was not about speed. It was about timing, about knowing exactly when attention had gathered, when the room had settled into a single point of focus, when every eye was positioned where he wanted it to be. Now they were. The soft hum of conversation had thinned into silence. Glasses hovered mid-air, forgotten. Even the servers, trained to move invisibly, slowed their pace, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Jackson stood at the center of it, one hand still loosely holding his glass, the other resting at his side. His posture was relaxed, confident. The kind of posture that suggested nothing unexpected was about to happen. He smiled. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "It means a lot to have everyone here, friends, family, colleagues, people who've been part of this journey." His gaze moved across the crowd, pausing briefly on familiar faces. Ethan Cole, Daniel Reeves, a few investors. Then, almost casually, it shifted to Lily. She stood just within his reach, close enough that the distance between them could no longer be explained as coincidence. Molly saw the shift before anyone else reacted. Not because it was obvious, but because she had been waiting for it. Jackson lowered his glass slowly, placing it on the nearest table without looking away from Lily. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. A transition, the kind that suggested intention without announcing it. A few people in the room exchanged glances, subtle, uncertain. Something about the alignment felt off. But no one spoke, because no one wanted to be the first to misinterpret what they were seeing. Jackson stepped closer. Lily did not step back. That detail registered, not just with Molly, with others now too. The space between them closed, and in that silence, thin, fragile, stretched across the room like glass, Jackson leaned in. There was no hesitation, no glance to gauge reaction, no awareness of the boundary he was crossing. Or perhaps no concern. His hand lifted slightly, brushing against Lily's arm as he kissed her. It was not accidental, not brief enough to dismiss, not ambiguous. It was clear, defined, public. The room froze. Not metaphorically. Literally. Movement stopped, breath paused, sound collapsed into something so thin it barely existed. A glass somewhere near the back made a soft, accidental contact with the edge of a table. No one turned toward it. All attention remained fixed at the center. Jackson did not pull away immediately. When he did, it was with the same calm he had carried into the moment, as if nothing had shifted, as if everything remained exactly where he expected it to be. Lily held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled. Not uncertain, not embarrassed, certain. That was the detail that spread through the room like something unspoken. Because certainty implied expectation. And expectation implied that this, whatever it was, had existed before now. Murmurs began, low, contained. A ripple rather than a reaction. No one confronted him. No one spoke his name. No one asked the question that hovered just beneath the surface. What are you doing? Because asking it would require acknowledging the answer. And the answer was already visible. At the edge of the room, Molly Carter remained still. Her posture had not changed. Her expression had not shifted. She did not look away. She did not look down. She watched. Not the kiss, the room, the reactions, the people who chose silence, the ones who turned slightly as if distancing themselves without fully disengaging, the ones who remained fixed, unsure how to respond, the ones who looked at her, because eventually they all did. It happened gradually, one by one. Their attention moved, from Jackson, from Lily, to Molly, waiting, expecting. Something. A reaction, a fracture, a moment that would restore the balance of the scene. Because without it, the silence became heavier, more uncomfortable. Molly did not give them that moment. She allowed the silence to settle, to expand, to become something no one could ignore. Then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically. She stepped forward with the same measured pace she had used all morning, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the polished floor. Each step carried weight, not because of urgency, but because of intention. Jackson noticed her then. Of course he did. His expression shifted just slightly. Not panic, not yet. Something closer to irritation. As if her movement disrupted a narrative he had not fully articulated. Molly, he began. She did not interrupt. She stopped at a distance that felt deliberate. Not close enough to invite intimacy. Not far enough to suggest withdrawal. Balanced, controlled. Her gaze met his. Steady, unwavering. There was no accusation in it. No visible hurt. No demand for explanation. Only presence. And that, more than anything, unsettled the room, because it offered nothing for people to respond to. No emotion to mirror, no conflict to engage with, just stillness. Molly's hand moved then, calmly, without hesitation. She reached for the gift bag placed on the table beside her. The same bag she had positioned earlier, soft tissue paper folded neatly inside. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from the others. She removed the folder. Thin, structured, unlabeled on the front. Clean. Jackson's eyes followed the movement. Confusion flickered. Brief, uncertain. Because this was not the reaction he had prepared for. This was not part of the structure he controlled. Molly, he said again, his voice lower, now less certain. What are you? She stepped forward, closed the distance just enough, and handed it to him. No force, no emphasis, just a simple transfer. Her fingers released the folder as his took it. The contact lasted less than a second. But in that second, something shifted. Not visibly, not loudly, but undeniably. Jackson looked down at the folder, then back at her. What is this? He asked. His tone carried something new now. Not authority, not control, uncertainty. Molly did not raise her voice. She did not look at Lily. She did not look at the room. She looked only at him. You should read it, she said. Her voice was quiet, even, precise. No additional words, no explanation, because none were necessary. The room held its breath again. But this time, it was different, because the moment no longer belonged to Jackson. It had shifted, completely, irreversibly. And everyone in that room, even if they did not yet understand why, felt it. Jackson's grip on the folder tightened slightly. His thumb moved along the edge as if testing the weight of what he held. For the first time since he entered the room, he hesitated. And Molly remained still, watching. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what would happen next. Jackson Carter had built a career on composure. It was not simply confidence that carried him through rooms like this. It was control of tone, of timing, of perception. He knew how to respond before most people finished asking their questions. He knew how to redirect attention, how to smooth over tension, how to reframe discomfort as misunderstanding. But none of those instincts prepared him for silence that did not bend. The folder in his hand felt lighter than it should have, thin, ordinary, deceptively so. Around him, the room remained suspended, every conversation held just beneath the surface, waiting for permission to resume. That permission did not come. Not from him. Not from anyone else. Molly stood across from him, her posture unchanged, her expression as steady as it had been from the moment she stepped forward. There was no urgency in her stance, no demand, only presence. Jackson glanced down at the folder again, then back at her. "What is this?" he repeated, though the question had already lost its edge. Molly did not elaborate. "You should read it," she said again, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard, without drawing attention to itself. That was all. No accusation, no explanation, which left him with nothing to counter. For a brief moment, he considered not opening it. He could have laughed it off, redirected, dismissed the gesture as something personal, something inappropriate for the setting. He could have reclaimed the room with a joke, a shift in tone, a quick transition back to the event. That would have worked, under normal circumstances. But this was no longer normal. The room was watching, not just casually, not passively, waiting. And waiting created pressure. Jackson understood pressure. He also understood that ignoring it now would not dissolve it. So he opened the folder. The sound of paper shifting broke through the silence, small but sharp. The first page was clean, structured, a timeline. Dates aligned along the left margin, short, precise descriptions on the right. No commentary, no interpretation, just sequence. Jackson's eyes moved across it quickly at first, then slower, then again. The first entries were familiar. Routine transactions, internal approvals, nothing that would immediately raise concern. But then the pattern emerged. Virion Consulting, LLC. Repeated, structured. Amounts listed beside each entry. Not exaggerated, not inflated, just consistent. His expression did not collapse. It tightened, subtly, the kind of shift most people in the room would not recognize. But Molly did. She had expected it. He turned the page. The second section contained supporting documents, printed emails, headers intact, dates visible, nothing altered, nothing obscured. The language in them was his. That was unavoidable, because he had written it, or approved it, or forwarded it. Each message sat there without context. And without context, language lost its protection. Approved. Proceed. Handle externally. Short phrases. Efficient. Now exposed. Jackson's jaw shifted slightly as he read. He did not look up, not yet, because looking up would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would change the room. He turned another page. Bank transfers. Account numbers partially redacted. Dates aligned with the timeline. Amounts that individually might have been dismissed. Together they formed something else. A pattern. Deliberate, structured. His breathing remained steady, but his grip on the folder adjusted. Slightly tighter. The next section, audio transcripts. Short excerpts, time-stamped, not long enough to overwhelm, just enough to establish tone. Route it through Virion. No need to flag it internally. Keep it contained. His own voice, flattened into text, stripped of nuance, left with intention. Jackson exhaled slowly, not visibly, but enough that the shift registered again, not with most of the room. With Molly, and with one or two others who understood how to read beyond words. Daniel Reeves stood near the back, his posture unchanged, but his attention sharpened. Ethan Cole's expression had shifted as well, subtle, professional, but alert. They did not move. They did not speak. They observed, because this was no longer a private matter. It was becoming something else. Jackson reached the final section. A summary, not dramatic, not accusatory, a simple consolidation of what had already been shown. Transactions routed through Virion. Funds transferred to secondary accounts. Timing aligned with personal expenditures. No conclusions stated, no labels assigned. Just alignment. Jackson closed the folder, not abruptly, carefully, as if maintaining control of the motion could preserve control of the moment. He looked up at Molly. For the first time since he began reading, his expression was no longer anchored. It had not collapsed, but it had shifted. Uncertainty had entered. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked. His voice was lower now, measured, but missing something it had carried before. Authority. Molly did not move. "It's a record," she said. "Nothing more, no elaboration, because the content spoke for itself." Jackson glanced briefly toward the room. That was the mistake. Because in that glance, he saw it. Not judgment, not outrage. Something more difficult to manage. Recognition. The kind that did not require explanation. The kind that could not be redirected. He returned his attention to Molly. "This isn't complete," he said. "You don't have context." Molly nodded once. "I don't need it," she replied. The response was quiet, precise, final. A flicker of irritation surfaced. Brief, contained. "You're making assumptions," he said. Molly did not react. "I'm not making anything," she said. A nice silence followed. Not empty, heavy. Because the structure of the conversation had shifted in a way Jackson could not easily recover. There was no accusation to deny, no claim to dismantle. Only evidence placed in front of him, and witnesses who had seen enough. Across the room, Lily stood still. Her earlier certainty had softened, not entirely gone, but altered, because the space she had occupied moments ago had changed. She was no longer positioned beside Jackson, not in the way that mattered. The alignment had broken. Jackson felt it, even if he did not fully understand it yet. His eyes moved briefly toward her, then back to Molly. "What do you want?" he asked. The question landed differently, because it assumed negotiation, control, and exchange. Molly's expression did not change. Nothing, she said. The words settled into the room, clear, uncomplicated. Jackson's brow tightened slightly. "Then why you should finish reading," Molly said. She did not raise her voice. She did not step closer. But the interruption was precise. Enough to stop him. Enough to redirect. Because what remained was not in the folder. It was already in motion. The emails, the copies, the distribution. Jackson did not know that yet. But he would. Very soon, Molly held his gaze. Not with challenge, not with emotion, with certainty, because she understood something he was only beginning to feel. This was no longer a moment he could control. It had moved beyond him, beyond the room, beyond anything that could be contained with explanation. The dossier had done its work, quietly, completely. And the silence that followed was no longer waiting for him. It was waiting for what came next. The silence that followed the closing of the folder did not dissolve. Instead, it deepened in a way that made the room feel smaller, as if the carefully arranged space had begun to contract around the people inside it. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever they might have said would have required choosing a side before they fully understood what they had just witnessed. That hesitation created a kind of suspended awareness, one that Molly had anticipated long before she stepped forward. Jackson still held the dossier, his fingers resting along the edge as though maintaining physical contact with it could somehow stabilize the situation, yet his attention was no longer anchored in the pages. He was thinking now, recalibrating, searching for an angle that would allow him to reclaim control, because that had always been his instinct when confronted with pressure. However, control required a narrative, and the narrative had already begun to slip away from him in ways he could not yet fully see. Molly did not move, but she understood precisely when the shift occurred. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a vibration. A phone somewhere near the left side of the room buzzed against the surface of a table. The sound was subtle, easily dismissed under normal circumstances, yet in the silence that now filled the space, it carried further than intended. The guest who owned it glanced down instinctively, perhaps expecting a routine message, a reminder, or a social notification that could be ignored without consequence. Instead, his expression changed. He did not speak. He did not react outwardly. He simply looked at the screen longer than necessary, then lifted his gaze not toward Jackson, but toward Molly. A second vibration followed, then a third. Within moments, the quiet rhythm spread across the room, not in unison, but in sequence, as if the entire space had been connected by an unseen thread that had just been pulled. Phones buzzed in pockets on tables inside handbags. Each one carried the same message, the same attachment, the same carefully timed release of information that Molly had arranged before she ever stepped into the venue that morning. Jackson noticed it then, not immediately as a pattern, but as disruption. His eyes moved across the room, tracking the subtle changes in posture, the way conversations did not resume, but instead fractured into silence, the way people began to look not at each other, but at their screens. Confusion surfaced first, followed by something more focused, something closer to recognition. "What is this?" he asked again, though the question no longer held authority. Molly did not answer. She did not need to, because the room was answering for her. Ethan Cole was among the first to step slightly aside, his attention fixed on his phone as he scrolled through the email that had just arrived. His expression did not betray emotion in any overt way, but there was a tightening at the corners of his eyes. A shift in posture that suggested the information he was reading required immediate processing. As head of human resources, he was trained to recognize risk not only in behavior, but in documentation and patterns that indicated exposure beyond the individual. Daniel Reeves reacted differently. He did not step away or isolate himself. Instead, he remained where he was, his phone held lower, his gaze moving between the screen and Jackson with a level of focus that was more analytical than emotional. He was not surprised, not entirely, because what he saw in the email aligned with inconsistencies he had likely encountered in fragments before pieces that had not yet formed a complete picture until now. Around them, the rest of the room began to shift more visibly. Guests who had arrived expecting a celebration now found themselves holding documents they did not expect to see in this setting: bank records, email, excerpt, structured timelines that mirrored the contents of the dossier in Jackson's hands. Some scrolled quickly, attempting to understand the scope all at once, while others moved more slowly, reading line by line, as if confirming each detail before allowing themselves to react. No one laughed. No one dismissed it, because the material did not invite dismissal. It was too precise, too consistent, too aligned. Jackson felt the shift before he fully understood it, the way a person feels the change in air pressure before a storm breaks. His grip on the folder tightened again, not out of anger, but out of instinct, as if holding on to it might allow him to control the flow of information that was clearly moving beyond him. "You sent this?" he asked, his voice lower now, directed at Molly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said. The simplicity of the answer removed any space for denial. There was no attempt to disguise the action, no effort to soften its impact. It was stated plainly as fact, and in that plainness it carried more weight than any accusation could have. Jackson glanced around the room again, this time with greater urgency, because he could see it now in full, the alignment of attention, the way individuals who had once deferred to him were no longer looking to him for cues, but instead looking at the information in their hands, measuring it against what they knew, what they had seen, what they could no longer ignore. "This is being taken out of context," he said, though the words felt thinner as he spoke them. No one responded. Not immediately. Because context required explanation, and explanation required time. And time was something he no longer controlled. Ethan Cole stepped forward slightly, his phone still in his hand. "Jackson," he said, his tone professional but firm, "we'll need to review this." The phrasing was careful, not accusatory, not public, but unmistakably procedural. Jackson turned toward him, seizing on the familiarity of the interaction. "Of course," he said quickly. "There's context here that we'll review it," Ethan repeated, cutting through the sentence without raising his voice. The interruption landed with quiet precision, because it shifted the dynamic from conversation to process, from personal to institutional. And once that shift occurred, it could not be reversed. Daniel Reeves did not speak, but he stepped closer, his presence alone, reinforcing the direction the moment was taking. He did not need to ask questions yet. The material in front of him had already raised them, and those questions would not be answered in a room like this. Lily Hart remained where she was, but the certainty that had defined her earlier had diminished. She held her phone now as well, her eyes moving across the same information, though. Her reaction was different, less controlled, more immediate, as if the reality of her position within the structure Molly had exposed was only now becoming clear. Molly observed all of it, without shifting her posture. She did not look at Lily. She did not look at the others. Her focus remained on Jackson, not because he was still in control, but because he was no longer. That distinction mattered. The room had changed, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through exposure. Information had moved from private to public, from contained to distributed, and in that movement, it had stripped away the framework that had allowed Jackson to operate without challenge. He understood that now. Not completely, but enough to feel it. "This isn't how this works," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Molly's expression remained calm. "It is now," she replied. The words were not sharp. They did not carry anger, but they carried finality. Because what had been set in motion could not be undone by explanation, by authority, or by the presence of witnesses who had already seen enough to know that something larger than a personal betrayal had just entered the room. The emails continued to arrive, not because they had been sent repeatedly, but because people were opening them at different moments. Each new reaction adding to the quiet accumulation of understanding that spread across the space. No one announced it. No one declared it. But it settled there unmistakably. This was no longer a celebration. It was an inflection point. And everyone present, whether they acknowledged it aloud or not, knew they were standing inside it. The room did not explode. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown across the polished tables, no dramatic confrontations that would have satisfied an audience looking for spectacle. Instead, the energy shifted inward, becoming quieter, more concentrated, as if every person present had instinctively understood that what had just been revealed did not belong to public argument, but to something colder, more structured, and far less forgiving. Procedure had entered the room, and procedure did not require volume. Within minutes, the event began to dissolve, though no one formally announced its end. Conversations broke into smaller clusters, then into private exchanges, then into silence, as individuals made decisions about how quickly they needed to leave, who they needed to call, and what distance they needed to create between themselves and what had just surfaced. Ethan Cole stepped aside, already dialing a number, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he was transitioning from guest to professional responsibility. His words were low-measured, but urgent enough to signal that whatever process he was initiating would not wait until Monday morning or the next scheduled meeting. Daniel Reeves did not call anyone immediately. Instead, he remained still for a moment longer, reviewing the material on his phone, cross-referencing it mentally with reports he had seen in the past. His role required patience, but it also required recognition. And what he recognized now was not a single inconsistency, but a pattern that demanded formal review. Jackson stood at the center of it, all the folder still in his hand, though its presence had become almost symbolic at this point. The real movement had already begun outside of it, in emails, in calls, in the silent alignment of people who understood that the situation had moved beyond personal explanation. "This isn't necessary," he said, his voice controlled but strained as he approached Molly again. "We can handle this privately." The words were carefully chosen, privately, contained, manageable. Molly met his gaze without shifting her stance. "It's already not private," she replied. There was no emphasis in her tone. No need for it, because the room itself had already confirmed the truth of what she was saying. Jackson exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he attempted to recalibrate, to find a path back into control. For years, he had operated within systems that rewarded confidence, that allowed decisive language to override uncertainty, that relied on perception as much as substance. But this was different, because the system had changed. He could feel it in the way people no longer deferred to him, in the way conversations continued, without his involvement, in the way attention had shifted away from his presence and toward the information that now existed independently of him. "I need to understand what you think this accomplishes," he said, lowering his voice further. Molly did not step back. She did not raise her own voice to match his. "It protects me," she said. The answer was immediate, clear, uncomplicated. Jackson blinked once, as if the simplicity of the response had caught him off guard. "From what?" he asked. Molly held his gaze. "From being part of it." The words settled between them, precise and immovable. For the first time, something in Jackson's expression shifted beyond control. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to recognition. Because in that moment, he understood what she had done, not just in the room, but before it. She had positioned herself outside of the structure, legally, deliberately. And that realization carried implications he could not immediately contain. "You're overreacting," he said, though the words lacked the certainty that they once would have held. "This isn't, it's already being reviewed." Molly interrupted, not sharply, but with enough precision to redirect the conversation. Jackson paused. "By who?" Molly did not hesitate. Legal, audit, the bank. She did not list names. She did not elaborate. She did not need to, because the presence of those entities, implied or real, shifted the framework entirely. This was no longer a discussion. It was a process. Behind them, movement continued. Guests were leaving now, quietly offering brief, controlled farewells that avoided direct engagement with either of them. Some glanced toward Molly with something that resembled acknowledgement. Others avoided eye contact altogether, choosing distance over involvement. No one approached Jackson. That more than anything marked the change. He was no longer the center. He was the subject. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Once, then again. He ignored it at first, maintaining eye contact with Molly as if refusing to break focus might preserve something of the moment. But the vibrations continued, relentless. Eventually, he reached for it. The screen lit up with notifications, emails, multiple subjects he recognized, senders he could not ignore. He opened one, then another. His expression did not collapse, but the control he had maintained began to thin, stretched across too many points of pressure to hold completely intact. "They're asking for documentation," he said, more to himself than to Molly. Molly did not respond, because she already knew. They're freezing review access. He continued, scrolling, his movements less measured now. He stopped. Another message, different sender, shorter, more direct. He read it once, then again, and this time, when he looked up, the shift was visible. Clear, unavoidable. "They've suspended my access," he said. The words hung in the air, not loud but heavy. Molly did not react outwardly. She did not step forward. She did not offer explanation. Because this was not her action. This was the system responding. And the system, once activated, did not move with emotion. It moved with procedure. Rachel's words returned to her then, not as memory, but as confirmation. Once it surfaces, it will move fast. Jackson lowered the phone slightly, his grip tightening around it. His mind already moving ahead, calculating, attempting to map out responses, defenses, explanations that might slow the process. But he was no longer ahead of it. He was inside it. And inside a system like this, control was limited. "Molly," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier structure, "we need to talk." She looked at him steadily. "We will," she said. "Through counsel." The phrasing was deliberate, formal, final. It removed the possibility of private negotiation. It placed everything within a framework that did not bend to personal appeal. Jackson held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, an opening, a shift, a sign that this could still be redirected. There was none. Only calm. Only certainty. And the quiet understanding that what had begun here would not end here. Molly turned then, not abruptly, but with the same measured movement she had carried throughout the day. She reached for her coat. Her actions unhurried, unaffected by the movement, still unfolding behind her. As she stepped away, the room continued to thin, the last remnants of the event dissolving into absence. No one stopped her. No one asked her to stay, because whatever had needed to happen had already happened, and everything that followed would no longer belong to this room. It would belong to process, to documentation, to law. And Molly Carter had already positioned herself exactly where she needed to be within it. The aftermath did not unfold in a single direction. It branched. Quietly at first, then with increasing clarity, as each person who had been present at the baby shower began to process what they had seen and what had been placed in their hands. Information did not remain static once it left the room. It moved through inboxes, through calls, through conversations that were careful in tone, but decisive in intent. And within that movement, positions began to shift. Not publicly, not all at once, but steadily. Lily Hart felt it before anyone said it to her directly. It began the same way it had for everyone else, with a phone vibrating, a message arriving, a file opening that contained more than she had expected to see. At first, she had read quickly, her eyes scanning for familiar references, searching for something she could recognize and dismiss as misinterpretation. But there was too much alignment, too much detail, too many points where her own name appeared not in isolation, but within structures she could not easily explain away. She had been careful, or at least she had believed she was. Careful in the way someone is when they understand they are stepping outside formal boundaries, but assume those boundaries are flexible if the right person allows them to be. Jackson had allowed it, encouraged it, even though not always in ways that could be traced cleanly. His language had been indirect, his instructions framed as efficiency, as trust, as opportunity. "You're capable of handling this. Just route it through the usual channel. No need to escalate every detail." At the time, it had felt like advancement. Now the same phrases appeared in transcripts, stripped of tone, stripped of context, arranged in a way that suggested something else entirely. Responsibility. Lily stood near the edge of the room as it emptied, her posture still composed, though the certainty that had defined her earlier presence had begun to fracture in ways she could not fully control. She watched as people left without acknowledging her, as conversations shifted away from her proximity, as attention moved elsewhere. not because she was invisible, but because she had become part of something people preferred not to engage with directly. She did not approach Jackson immediately, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood instinctively that proximity to him no longer offered protection. It carried risk. Instead, she stepped aside, moving toward a quieter corner near the entrance, where the last few guests gathered their things. She opened her phone again, rereading the email that had arrived during the event, this time. More slowly, more carefully, as if a second reading might reveal a version of it that aligned with what she had believed only hours earlier. It did not. The structure held, the connections remained, and her name remained within them. A message appeared at the top of her screen. Unknown number, short, direct. We need to speak regarding your involvement. No signature, no explanation. But the implication was clear. Lily stared at the message for a moment, her mind moving quickly through possible responses, possible explanations, possible ways to frame her role as limited, as procedural, as guided, rather than initiated. But every option depended on something she no longer had. Control of the narrative. Across the room, Jackson was still speaking with Ethan Cole and Daniel Reeves, though the nature of the conversation had shifted entirely. There was no longer any attempt at maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The tone was professional, contained structured around next steps rather than explanation. Lily watched him for a moment. He did not look at her. Not once. That detail settled into place with quiet finality, because it confirmed what she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She had not been an equal participant. She had been positioned, and positions, when exposed, were reassessed. She moved toward the exit without drawing attention, her steps measured, her expression controlled. The staff at the front desk offered a polite farewell, unaware of the shift that had occurred inside the room, or perhaps aware but trained not to acknowledge it. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, sharper. Lily paused briefly near the curb, her phone still in her hand, the message waiting unanswered. She glanced back toward the building, as if expecting something to follow her out. Some continuation of the moment that had begun inside. Nothing did. The door remained closed. The event, whatever it had become, was over. But the process had just begun. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, a space that had once felt like progress, like independence, like the visible result of a trajectory she believed she controlled. Now it felt temporary, uncertain. Her laptop sat open in front of her, the same email displayed on the screen, alongside several others that had arrived since she left the venue. Requests, clarifications, formal language that avoided accusation but carried weight. She read each one carefully, her responses forming and dissolving before she could commit to them. Every sentence she considered writing felt incomplete, insufficient against the structure that had already been established without her input. Because the structure did not rely on her explanation. It relied on documentation. And documentation had already spoken. Lily leaned back in her chair, her eyes moving toward the window where the city lights reflected faintly against the glass. She had believed at some point that proximity to power would offer stability, that alignment with someone like Jackson would create opportunity without consequence. She understood now that it had created something else. Exposure. Not immediate, not obvious, but inevitable. Because systems built on quiet assumptions eventually encountered something they could not absorb. Something structured, something deliberate, something like Molly Carter. Lily did not think about Molly in terms of anger or resentment. She thought about her in terms of clarity. The way she had stood in that room, the way she had spoken, the way she had moved without hesitation, without visible emotion, without needing to explain what she had already made visible. That kind of clarity was difficult to confront, because it left no space to negotiate. Lily looked back at her phone. The message still waited. She knew she would have to respond. Not immediately, but soon. Because silence in this context would not protect her. It would only delay what was already unfolding. And delay was no longer enough. Across the city, in another part of the same unfolding structure, Molly Carter sat in her own home, her environment once again quiet, contained, unchanged in appearance, but not in meaning. She did not think about Lily, not directly, because Lily was not the center of what had happened. She was a part of it, a visible one, but not the origin. Molly's focus remained where it had always been, on structure, on sequence, on the process that had already begun to move beyond any single person's control. And within that process, one thing had become clear. The moment of exposure had passed. Now came consequence. The days that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no sudden confrontations, no emotional collapses, no visible unraveling that could be traced in a straight line from the moment of exposure. Instead, everything moved with a kind of measured inevitability, as if the structure Molly had set in motion had already determined the pace at which events would unfold. Procedure replaced reaction. Documentation replaced argument. And within that shift, the marriage between Molly Carter and Jackson Carter began to separate, not through a single decision, but through a series of steps that carried the same quiet precision as everything Molly had done leading up to that moment. The first step came the following morning. Molly did not wait for Jackson to reach out. She contacted Rachel Lynn. Their conversation was brief, efficient, and entirely focused on process. "I'm ready to formalize separation," Molly said. Rachel did not ask for explanation. She had expected this. "All right," she replied. "We'll start with asset protection and temporary arrangements. Do you have access to joint accounts?" "Yes." "Good. We'll document everything as it stands today. No changes without record. And Molly, do not engage with him directly about financial matters." "I won't." There was a pause. "How are you?" Rachel asked the question quieter, less procedural. Molly considered it for a moment. "I'm clear," she said. Rachel exhaled softly. "That's enough," she replied. The call ended. From that point forward, Molly's interactions with Jackson shifted entirely into formal channels. Emails, legal correspondence, structured communication that removed ambiguity and eliminated the possibility of informal negotiation. Jackson resisted at first, not openly, not aggressively, but through attempts to re-establish direct contact. He called. She did not answer. He texted. She did not respond. Eventually, a message arrived that carried a different tone. "We need to talk. This isn't something that should go through lawyers." Molly read it once, then set her phone down. The response, when it came, was sent hours later. "Please direct all communication through counsel." Nothing more, no explanation, no acknowledgement of emotion. Because emotion was no longer relevant to what was unfolding. Jackson received the message while sitting in his office, though office was no longer entirely accurate. His access had been limited, his responsibilities reassigned, his presence within Helixara Health reduced to something transitional. Temporary, under review. He understood the language. He had used it himself in other contexts when managing internal risk. Now it applied to him. The company's response had been swift, though not public. Internal audit procedures had been initiated. Financial access had been restricted. Meetings had been scheduled not with him, but about him. He was still technically in position, but the structure around him had shifted, and he could feel it. He read Molly's message again, then again, as if repetition might reveal something he had missed. It did not. The boundary was clear, and it was not one he could move. Later that afternoon, he met with legal representation arranged through the company. The conversation was controlled, focused on risk assessment, potential exposure, and the steps required to navigate what was now an active investigation. "You need to limit communication," the attorney said. "Anything you say outside of counsel can be used against you, internally or otherwise." Jackson nodded, though the act felt mechanical. "And your wife," the attorney continued. "She's retained counsel," Jackson said. "Then you should assume everything is being documented." Jackson leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment. "She doesn't need to do this," he said more quietly. The attorney did not respond to that, because it was not relevant. Need had nothing to do with it. Process did. Across town, Molly sat in Rachel's office, reviewing documents that outlined the initial terms of separation. Temporary custody arrangements, financial disclosures, property status. Each section was presented clearly, without excess language, without interpretation. Molly read everything carefully, not because she doubted it, but because she understood the importance of precision. "Do you want to remain in the house?" Rachel asked. "Yes. Then we'll file for exclusive use during the separation period." Molly nodded, and Jackson Rachel continued. "He'll need to find alternative accommodation." Molly did not react to that. She did not consider where he would go, because that was no longer her responsibility. The conversation moved forward, step by step, each decision grounded in documentation, each action aligned with process. There was no urgency, only sequence. That evening, Molly returned home. The house was quiet, unchanged in appearance, but different in meaning. Jackson was not there. His absence did not create a void. It created space. Molly moved through the room slowly, not searching, not reflecting, simply acknowledging the environment as it now existed. Her phone remained on the counter. Silent. No missed calls, no new messages, because the line of communication had been redirected. And that redirection held. Days passed, then a week. The legal process continued. Documents were exchanged, requests were made, responses were structured. Jackson complied where required. Though not without resistance, subtle delays, questions framed as clarifications, attempts to retain some measure of control over how information was presented. But the structure did not shift, because it was no longer his to manage. At Helix Sara, the internal review expanded. Forensic analysis confirmed what Molly had already documented. Funds had been routed, systems had been bypassed. Responsibility was being traced. Carefully, deliberately. There was no public announcement, not yet. But internally, positions were being reassessed. Jackson's role was no longer stable, and he knew it. One evening, as Molly sat near the window, the soft light of early evening settling across the room, she felt the subtle movement of the child she carried. She rested her hand there, not out of habit, but with awareness. This, more than anything else, was the constant. The reason she had moved the way she had. The reason she had chosen clarity over confrontation. Structure over reaction. Because stability, once compromised, required rebuilding. Not emotionally, systemically. Molly did not think about Jackson in that moment. She did not revisit the baby shower. She did not replay the kiss or the silence or the shift that had followed. Those moments had served their purpose. They had marked a transition. But they were not the outcome. The outcome was this: separation. Defined, documented, irreversible. And within that outcome, Molly Carter remained exactly where she intended to be. Not at the center of conflict, but outside of it, protected, clear, and moving forward without needing to look back. The final stage did not arrive with a clear announcement. There was no single moment that marked the end, no visible line, and separating what had been from what would follow. Instead, the transition unfolded gradually through decisions that no longer required deliberation, through routines that settled into place, without resistance, through the quiet understanding that what had once defined Molly Carter's life no longer held authority over it. By the time the legal process moved into its later phases, the structure had already stabilized. Documents had been filed, accounts had been separated. Temporary arrangements had become consistent enough to feel permanent. Jackson Carter's presence in Molly's daily life had diminished to the point of absence. Not erased, not forgotten, but no longer active in any way that required her attention. Communication remained exactly where she had placed it. Through counsel, structured, limited, precise. He had attempted once or twice to shift that boundary. A message sent late at night, a call placed without prior notice. Each attempt was met with the same response: silence or redirection. Because Molly understood that boundaries once set required consistency to hold. And consistency had always been her strength. At Helixara Health, the internal review reached conclusions that had been forming long before they were formally stated. The findings did not arrive publicly, not at first, but within the company. The implications were clear. Financial irregularities had been confirmed. Processes had been bypassed. Responsibility had been assigned. Jackson's position did not survive that process. His removal was handled quietly, framed within the language of corporate transition, but those who needed to understand the underlying reason did. And they did not question it. Lily Hart's involvement was addressed differently, not because her role was insignificant, but because it was secondary. She was not positioned as the architect of what had occurred. But she was not removed from it either. Her name remained within the documentation, within the structure of decisions that had been made, within the communications that had been preserved. Her trajectory shifted. Opportunities that had once seemed open narrowed. Not through direct accusation, but through association. The system adjusted, as it always did. Molly did not follow those developments closely. She was informed when necessary through Rachel, through formal updates, through documentation that required her review. But she did not seek additional detail, because the outcome of those processes did not alter her position. They did not change what had already been established. Weeks passed, then months. Time moved forward without interruption, carrying with it a sense of steadiness that Molly had not realized she had been missing until it returned. The house in Westport remained, not as a symbol of what had been, but as a space that had been redefined. Rooms that once held shared routines now reflected a different rhythm, quieter, more intentional. Molly moved through them with ease, not because they were unchanged, but because she no longer viewed them through the lens of what had been lost. Nothing had been lost. It had been clarified. The day her child was born arrived without complication. It was early morning, the kind of quiet hour, where the world outside had not yet fully awakened. The hospital room was clean, controlled, structured in the same way Molly had come to rely on in every other aspect of her life. Rachel visited briefly. Molly's parents were present. Support existed, but it was calm, contained. There were no dramatic scenes, no unresolved conversations. Jackson was not there. His absence was not discussed. It did not need to be, because the structure that defined their separation extended into this moment as well. Molly did not feel the need to fill that absence with explanation. She focused on what was present, on what was real, on what required her attention. When she held her child for the first time, the world did not shift dramatically. There was no overwhelming surge of emotion that disrupted everything else. Instead, there was clarity, a continuation of the same steady awareness that had guided her through every decision she had made over the past months. This was the reason. Not the exposure, not the process, not the outcome. This? She looked down at the small, steady movement in her arms, her expression calm, her breathing even. There was no need to speak. No need to define the moment beyond what it already was. Time continued. Recovery was steady. Routine returned in new forms. Feeding schedules, quiet nights, mornings that began earlier than they once had, but with a sense of purpose that did not require adjustment. Molly adapted without strain. Not because change was easy, but because she had already done the work required to make it sustainable. The legal process concluded without spectacle. Final documents were signed, agreements formalized, separation became permanent. There were no dramatic confrontations at the end, no final exchanges that attempted to rewrite what had already been established. Because everything that needed to be said had been said. Not in words, in actions, Jackson moved forward in his own way. Outside the structure he had once controlled. Rebuilding perhaps, reframing, but no longer connected to Molly's path. Their lives no longer intersected, not in any way that required her attention. Molly did not track his progress. She did not revisit the past, because neither served a purpose. Instead, she moved forward, deliberately, calmly, with the same precision that had defined her at every stage. One evening, months later, Molly stood once again by the window in her living room. The same space, the same quiet street beyond. But the meaning had changed. Her child slept in the next room. The house was still. Not empty, complete. Molly rested her hand lightly against the glass, her reflection looking back at her without distortion. There was no visible transformation. No outward sign of what she had navigated. Only steadiness. Only clarity. Because dignity did not require recognition. It did not need to be announced. It existed in the choices made quietly, in the moments where reaction could have taken control, but did not, in the decisions that prioritized structure over impulse, truth over comfort. Molly Carter had not won anything. She had not defeated anyone. She had simply removed herself from something that no longer aligned with what she understood to be true. And in doing so, she had preserved something far more valuable than control. She had preserved herself. The world outside continued as it always did, unaware, unchanged. But inside that house, everything had been redefined. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And clarity, once established, did not require revisiting. It held, quietly, completely. The story does not end with noise. It settles. Like a room after everyone has left, where the echoes of what happened remain, but no longer demand attention. Molly Carter never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She never needed to fight publicly to prove her worth. Instead, she chose something far more difficult. She chose patience, structure, and truth. In a world where silence is often mistaken for weakness, she used it as her strongest position. She observed when others reacted. She documented when others ignored. And when the moment came, she did not destroy, she revealed. Not for revenge, but for clarity. Some endings do not come with closure that feels satisfying in the way people expect. They come with understanding. With the quiet recognition that dignity is not something you reclaim in a single moment, but something you protect over time. Through decisions no one else sees. If you stayed with this story until the end, you understand that not every victory needs to be loud. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is walk away completely calmly and without looking back. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and it's always meaningful to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe in stories that reveal truth quietly but powerfully, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.